The verse that I have sought to be governed by above all others in the Bible. Don't say I've always done it well, but this has been my goal. It's John 5:44, where Jesus said, "How can you believe, who receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that comes from God only, or the only God?" You might like to know that verse, probably more than any other in the four Gospels, unveils the real reason the Jews missed their Messiah. People ask me all the time, how come the Jews missed it? It was so obvious. John 5:44. Jesus asked the Pharisees a question. The question was, how can you believe? In other words, you can't. You can't. Surprise, surprise. You can't believe. You know why you can't believe? Because you are preoccupied with one thing: receiving the honor that comes from one another. And so it's all consensus. We're all agreed on this. You don't want to do anything that would go against consensus. This is why Nicodemus came by night. What he did secretly so no one would see him. It was a scary thing. But all of them together, they wanted to make sure that they were agreed, looking over their shoulders. You see, that verse is relevant for all of us today. I again refer to Jonathan Edwards. The task of every generation is to discover in which direction the sovereign Redeemer is moving, then move in that direction. When God is at work, your first reaction might be to say, "That's not God. That is not God," when it might be. But you don't see it that way because you are so focused on what will people think. And so if a movement of the Spirit comes along and it's a bit strange and odd, and you think, oh, if I am seen getting involved with this, what will my friends say? One evening in London, my friend Lyndon Bowring, who's chairman of CARE, and Charlie Colchester, who at the time was church warden of Holy Trinity Brompton. The three of us were going to see a film that night, Schindler's List. But before the film, we stopped at a Chinese restaurant in Soho. We're sitting around the table, and Charlie Colchester, church warden of Holy Trinity Brompton, says, "Have you guys heard about this Toronto thing?" I looked at Lyndon, he looked at me, "Toronto? What do you mean?" "Well," he said, "I don't know where to start." He said, "At our church, it's known as HTB, they pray for people, and they fall to the floor, and then they start laughing their heads off. That's what happens." He said, "What do you guys think of that?" Well, I looked at Lyndon, he looked at me. If you'd put me under a lie detector and asked me, did I believe that was of God, I would have said no. I find that offensive. Besides, if it really was of God, it would have come to Westminster Chapel first. We were the ones that had borne the heat of the day. At Holy Trinity Brompton, they weren't out on the streets witnessing to tramps and tourists. Besides, the Church of England, which we all know is apostate, with their Sloane Square accents, Etonians on the staff, the high and the mighty God wouldn't do that. That very week, I had sent to a printer a little card to be printed up. And the card was to be a prayer covenant that the members of Westminster Chapel would sign. 300 signed this card. And among other things on the card was a promise to pray every day, quote, for the manifestation of God's glory in our midst, along with an ever-increasing openness in us to the manner in which God chooses to turn up. Now, why did I word it that way? Well, you heard me refer to the Cane Ridge revival. What I didn't tell you is this. That Sunday morning in the summer of 1802, when that Methodist lay preacher took his text from 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the things done in the body, whether they be good or bad. As he spoke, where there were estimated 15,000 people gathered around him, the Spirit of God came down in such power that all of a sudden hundreds fell to the ground. Nobody praying for them, nobody pushing them. They just fell. Unexpected power. And panic set in because some of them they thought were dead. They couldn't even get a pulse. And they just lay there. It appeared, they said sometimes there would be 2 beats a minute. Well, you can't live on that. But hours later, they would come out of it consciously and shouting with great assurance of salvation. And when this would happen, hundreds of others would fall to the ground. They said it was the sound of Niagara. You could hear them shouting a mile away. And people would come to bust up the meeting, and they walk in, and instead of busting it up, they would fall and be converted. And for the next 4 days, from Sunday to Wednesday, there were no fewer than 500 people right out on the ground. Flat out. Knowing about that story, and knowing of Westminster Chapel's history, you know, the English are the most traditional people in the world, and Westminster Chapel was the most traditional church in England. And here I was praying for revival, and I thought about, what if something like Cane Ridge happens here at Westminster Chapel? I don't know how they're going to take that. So I worded the prayer. We pray for the manifestation of God's glory. Very happy about that. In our midst, happy about that. Along with an ever-increasing openness in us to the way God chooses to manifest His glory. Because I wanted our people to be prepared for the most extreme kind of situation, because God might do that just to embarrass us all. Well, now, that week that I heard about this Toronto blessing, as it came to be known, which had broken out at Holy Trinity Brompton, when I introduced the prayer covenant and I went through all the points, I acknowledged that what was going on in a particular church in town, everybody knew what I meant. And I said to them, this is not it. This is not it. And publicly disavowed what was going on at HTB as being of God. A few weeks later, a man by the name of Ken Costa, who, as it happens, was the other church warden of HTB. He's a prominent London banker. And we ended up being very good friends. But he phoned me. And he said, something unusual is happening at HTB, and I don't know what to make of it. And he said, would you have lunch with me and help me? And then he said, do you have any sermons on 1 John 4, verses 1 to 4? It happens that I had 4 sermons on 1 John 4, 1 to 4. Try the spirits, see whether they are of God. And so he sent a courier over and got all 4 sermons, and he read them all. We had lunch. And I went there armed to warn him and say, stay away from this. But do you know something? Within an hour, just as he was talking, I could see something so clearly, and I was shaken rigid. I realized that in every great movement of the Spirit, there was an anti-movement. And many of them evangelicals opposed the Great Awakening, opposed the Welsh Revival. And I could be of one of 2 strains, either those for it or those against it. And I could see I'm on the wrong side I'm on the wrong side. I am opposing something. And I called Louise. As soon as I got home from that lunch, I said, honey, I've been wrong. That evening, called the deacons together, and I said, I've made a big mistake. On Sunday, I went to the pulpit and publicly climbed down, and I said, I'm sorry. What's going on at Holy Trinity Brompton is the work of God. I don't understand it. But I wouldn't blame anybody here if you go there. Get prayed for. If you come back, fine. If you don't, but go. One of the wisest decisions I ever made. And maybe you have been in a position to say, well, if revival comes, I'll know it. You see, that's the way it was with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. If you'd interviewed any one of them and asked them this question, if Messiah comes, do you believe you would recognize him? Oh, they said, well, we'll know him. No problem about that.